The wind tore through the trees like it wanted to rip them from the ground, and Elena could barely feel her own hands anymore. Her fingers were curled uselessly against her chest, the skin turning a pale shade of blue under the moonlight. She had stopped shivering 10 minutes ago, and somewhere in the fog of her mind, she knew that was not a good sign. It meant her body was giving up the fight to stay warm. She had been thrown out of the pack house less than an hour ago, dragged by her own stepmother through the front doors while the guards watched and said nothing. No one had come to help her. No one had even looked her in the eye. She remembered the sound of the door slamming shut behind her, the heavy iron bolt sliding into place, and then the silence of the snow swallowing every sound except her own ragged breathing. Elena pressed her back against the trunk of an old pine tree at the edge of the territory line, pulling her knees up to her chest as if that small motion could somehow keep the cold from eating through her. Her nightgown was soaked through, the thin fabric offering no protection against a storm that had turned the whole forest into a field of white. She could see her breath rising in front of her face, slower now, weaker, like even that simple act was becoming too much effort. She thought about how it had happened, replaying the last hour over and over because there was nothing else to do while she waited for the cold to finish its work. Her stepsister Clara had come to her room crying, saying that a valuable pendant belonging to the Pack Alpha's late wife had gone missing, and that it had been found hidden beneath Elena's mattress. Elena had never seen the pendant before in her life. She had said so, over and over, until her voice cracked from the desperation of trying to be believed. No one had believed her, not her stepmother who had raised her since she was 7 years old and never once looked at her with anything close to warmth, not the pack elders, who had been all too eager to remove an omega they considered a burden on the pack's resources, not even the guards who had once shared a kind word with her in passing. It did not matter that she had spent years working in the kitchens without complaint, waking before dawn to prepare meals for people who barely acknowledged her existence. It did not matter that she had never taken so much as a spare coin that was not hers. The accusation was enough. In a pack ruled by fear and old prejudices against low-ranking omegas, an accusation was as good as a conviction. Elena closed her eyes, and for a moment she allowed herself to think of her mother. Gone now for 11 years, taken by an illness the pack healers could not name. She wondered if her mother was somewhere watching this happen, and if she was, whether she felt any pity for the daughter she had left behind in a house full of strangers who wore the mask of family. The cold had stopped feeling like cold. Now it felt like nothing at all. A strange numbness spreading from her fingers and toes toward the center of her body. She knew, somewhere in the small rational part of her mind that was still working, that this was the moment when people simply closed their eyes and did not open them again. She was not ready to die. She had never even had the chance to truly live, to find out whether the world could hold anything other than cruelty for someone like her. But her body no longer seemed to care what she wanted. She let her head fall back against the rough bark of the tree, staring up at a sky choked with snow clouds, no stars visible, no moon to guide anyone who might be looking for her. No one was looking for her. No one even knew she was out here. That thought alone was almost more painful than the cold. Far in the distance, though she could not have known it yet, a convoy of black carriages was moving slowly along the border road that cut through Blackwood territory, their wheels crunching over packed snow, torches flickering weakly against the storm. Inside the lead carriage sat a man whose name struck fear into rival packs across 3 territories, a man known simply as the Alpha King, though very few people ever dared to say his name aloud without lowering their eyes first. Damien Ashgrave sat with his arms crossed, staring out the frosted window, half listening to his advisor drone on about trade agreements and border disputes that needed his signature before the end of the month. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long hours of travel. Ruling 5 territories left little room for anything resembling peace. Every waking moment seemed to demand a decision, a judgment, a verdict on matters that other men would have found overwhelming after a single day. Damien had learned long ago to carry the weight without letting it show. But tonight, for reasons he could not explain, something felt different. His wolf was restless beneath his skin, pacing in a way it had not done in years, as though it sensed something the rest of him could not yet name. He shifted in his seat, ignoring his advisor's continued murmuring about tariffs, and closed his eyes, trying to settle the uneasy feeling clawing at his chest. It was not fear. Damien Ashgrave did not know fear. Not anymore. Not since he had claimed his throne through blood and sacrifice that he rarely allowed himself to remember. This was something else. A pull. A tug somewhere beneath his ribs that made his wolf whine low in his mind, urging him towards something just out of reach. He opened his eyes and looked out the window again, at the endless white stretching into the dark trees on either side of the road. Blackwood territory was not the largest of the lands under his protection, but it had always been a troublesome one. ruled by an alpha who cared more for old traditions than for the well-being of the people beneath him. Damien had heard whispers over the years, stories of Omegas treated as little more than servants, of injustices swept quietly under the rug because no one dared challenge the pack's leadership. He had always meant to address it properly, and yet somehow there had always been something more urgent demanding his attention first. The carriage jolted suddenly, the horses whinnying in protest as the driver called out for them to slow. Damien sat up straighter, his senses sharpening instantly, years of instinct taking over, before his mind had even caught up with what was happening. His wolf surged forward inside him, no longer restless but alert, focused, certain of something the rest of him still could not explain. "Stop the carriage," Damien said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that needed no volume to be obeyed. His advisor, a steady man named Edmund who had served him for nearly a decade, looked at him with visible confusion. "Your Majesty, we are still an hour from the nearest inn. The storm is only getting worse. Surely whatever it is can wait until—" "Stop the carriage," Damien repeated, already reaching for the door handle before the vehicle had even come to a full stop. The moment his boots hit the snow, the cold bit into him instantly, but Damien barely registered it. His wolf was screaming at him now, an urgency he had not felt in years, pulling him toward the edge of the forest that ran alongside the road. Edmund called after him, voice edged with alarm, but Damien did not slow down. Something was out there. Someone was out there. He could feel it now, faint but unmistakable, a heartbeat that did not belong to any of the guards or soldiers traveling with his convoy. He moved through the trees with the speed and precision only an alpha of his strength could manage, snow crunching beneath his boots, breath fogging in front of his face. The storm made visibility difficult, but his senses were sharper than any ordinary man's, and he followed the faint thread of a heartbeat that grew weaker with every passing second. As if it were fighting a battle it was quickly losing. Then he saw her. A small figure curled against the base of a pine tree, barely visible beneath a thin layer of fresh snow that had already begun to settle over her still form. Her skin had taken on a pale, bluish tint that made his stomach twist with something close to panic, an emotion he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Her dark hair was matted with ice, her lips a shade of purple that told him exactly how little time remained. Damien dropped to his knees beside her without a second thought, his hands immediately going to her neck to search for a pulse. It was there but faint, fluttering unevenly like a candle flame moments from going out. He called her name before realizing he did not know it, and the absurdity of that thought barely registered before his training took over completely. He needed to get her warm immediately, or she would not survive the next few minutes. Without hesitation, Damien reached up and unclasped the heavy fur-lined cloak from around his shoulders, a garment that marked him instantly as royalty to anyone who saw it, woven with threads of deep midnight blue and lined with the fur of animals that existed nowhere else in the 5 territories. He did not think about what it meant to give it away. He simply wrapped it around her trembling body, tucking the edges beneath her as though she were something precious that needed protecting from the entire world. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him at all. "Whoever you are not dying in this snow tonight." He gathered her into his arms, her small frame feeling impossibly light against his chest, and rose to his feet in one fluid motion, already moving back toward the road where his convoy waited. Edmund's eyes went wide when he saw the king emerging from the tree line carrying an unconscious woman wrapped in his own royal cloak, but he had served Damien long enough to know better than to ask questions in a moment like this. "Get the healer," Damien barked, his voice sharper now, edged with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. "Now." The convoy erupted into motion, guards scrambling to prepare space in the largest carriage, someone rushing to fetch warm blankets and heated stones that had been packed for the journey. Damien carried Elena himself, refusing to hand her off to anyone else, laying her carefully across the cushioned bench inside his own carriage, as the healer, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace, climbed in after them, and immediately began checking for signs of frostbite along her fingers and toes. "She is severely hypothermic," Grace said after a moment, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. "A few more minutes out there and she would not have survived. We need to warm her slowly, too fast, and it could stop her heart." Damien nodded, watching as Grace worked, his eyes drawn again and again to the unconscious woman's face. There was something about her that unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. A pull he had felt from the moment his wolf first sensed her heartbeat in the storm. He told himself it was simply the shock of the situation, the strangeness of finding a woman half frozen to death at the edge of a territory he had been passing through by chance. But some deeper part of him, the part that had guided wolves for centuries before him, whispered that this was no coincidence at all. "Your Majesty," Edmund said quietly from the carriage doorway, glancing between his king and the unconscious woman with poorly concealed concern. We are still within Blackwood territory. If she belongs to this pack, there could be complications in taking her without permission from their alpha. Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes not leaving Elena's still form. She was left to die in the snow, Edmund. Whatever complications arise from saving her life are not complications I intend to concern myself with. Edmund said nothing further, recognizing the tone in his king's voice as one that did not invite argument. He stepped back, allowing Grace to continue her work, while Damien remained seated beside the woman whose name he still did not know, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest as though his own attention alone could keep her breathing steady. Outside, the storm continued to rage, snow piling higher against the carriage wheels. But inside, wrapped in warmth and the lingering scent of a cloak that belonged to a king, Elena's heartbeat began, slowly, to grow stronger. She did not know it yet, curled unconscious in a stranger's care, but the life she had known until tonight was already over. Whatever waited for her when she opened her eyes again would be nothing like the world that had cast her out to freeze. Elena's eyes opened to a ceiling she did not recognize, high and arched, painted with faint gold patterns that caught the light of a fire crackling somewhere nearby. For a moment she simply lay there, confused, her mind struggling to understand why she was warm, why the sheets beneath her were soft instead of frozen ground, why her body did not feel like it was dying anymore. Then the memories returned all at once, sharp and disorienting. The snow, her stepmother's cold expression as the door slammed shut, the feeling of her own heartbeat slowing beneath a tree she had thought would be the last thing she ever saw. Elena sat up so quickly that her head spun, and a heavy weight slid from her shoulders onto her lap. She looked down and saw the cloak. It was unlike anything she had ever touched before, thick fur lining a deep midnight blue fabric so finely woven, it seemed almost to shimmer even in the low firelight. She recognized instantly that this was not something an ordinary person owned. Only someone of significant power would wear a garment like this, and the realization sent a fresh wave of confusion crashing through her already exhausted mind. "You're awake." The voice came from a woman seated near the fire, her sharp eyes studying Elena with the practiced calm of someone used to tending the sick and injured. She rose and crossed the room, kneeling beside the bed to press 2 fingers gently against Elena's wrist, checking her pulse with quiet efficiency. "My name is Grace," the woman said. "I am a healer. You gave us quite a fright last night. Do you remember what happened to you?" Elena's throat felt raw, her voice barely more than a whisper when she finally managed to speak. "I was outside. In the snow. I don't understand. Where am I?" Grace's expression softened slightly, though there was something careful in the way she chose her next words. "You are in the royal convoy of King Damien Ashgrave. He found you in the forest near Blackwood territory, very close to freezing to death. He carried you here himself and insisted you receive immediate care." The name struck Elena like a physical blow. Everyone in the 5 territories knew the name Damien Ashgrave, spoken in hushed tones by pack elders who feared his power, and by common wolves who whispered stories about his ruthlessness in battle. She had never imagined she would ever be in the same room as him, let alone owe her life to him. "That cloak," Grace continued, nodding toward the garment still resting across Elena's lap, "belongs to him. He wrapped you in it himself when he found you. I have served this court for many years, and I have never once seen him remove that cloak for anyone." Elena's fingers curled instinctively around the fabric, uncertain what to say, uncertain what any of this meant. She had spent her entire life being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that she was beneath notice, that her survival or suffering mattered to no one. And now she was being told that the most powerful man in 5 territories had carried her from the snow with his own hands. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would he do that? He doesn't know me." Grace's expression turned thoughtful, and for a moment she seemed to consider her answer carefully before speaking. "I have wondered the same thing myself. His Majesty is not known for sentimentality. But whatever the reason, you are alive because of it, and that is what matters most right now." A soft knock interrupted them, and Grace rose to answer it, opening the door just enough to speak quietly with someone in the corridor beyond. Elena caught only fragments of the conversation, but she heard enough to understand that the king himself was asking after her condition, wanting to know the moment she woke. When Grace returned, her expression had shifted slightly, a careful neutrality settling over her features. "His Majesty would like to see you, if you feel well enough. There is no obligation. You have been through a great deal, and no one will force you to do anything you are not ready for." Elena's heart pounded at the thought of facing the man whose reputation alone was enough to silence entire rooms. But some part of her, The part that had survived years of cruelty by learning to face fear directly instead of hiding from it, pushed her to nod despite the exhaustion still weighing down her limbs. "I would like to thank him," she said, "for what he did." Grace helped her rise from the bed, offering a simple robe to wear over the thin sleeping gown someone had changed her into while she was unconscious. Elena's legs felt unsteady beneath her, weak from the ordeal of the previous night, but she managed to walk with Grace's assistance through a corridor lined with tapestries far grander than anything she had ever seen inside the Blackwood pack house. They stopped before a set of heavy wooden doors, and Grace knocked twice before pushing them open, revealing a room warmed by a large fireplace, its walls lined with maps and shelves of books. Damien stood near the window, his back to the door, dressed now in simple dark clothing instead of the formal attire she imagined a king might usually wear. When he turned to face her, Elena found herself momentarily unable to speak. He was younger than she had expected, though every rumor about him suggested a man far older, weathered by decades of ruling and warfare. His eyes were a striking shade of gray, sharp and assessing, and yet as he studied her, something in his expression softened in a way that did not match the stories she had heard about his cruelty. "You're awake," he said, echoing Grace's earlier words, though his voice carried a different weight entirely. "How are you feeling?" Elena swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the nervousness twisting in her stomach. "Better. Thanks to you, Your Majesty. I don't know how to properly express my gratitude for what you did. I would have died out there if you hadn't found me." Damien's jaw tightened slightly, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face that Elena could not quite name. Anger, perhaps, though not directed at her. "You should never have been out there in the first place," he said. "Would you be willing to tell me what happened? How you came to be alone in a storm, dressed in nothing but a nightgown, at the edge of Blackwood territory?" Elena hesitated, old habits of silence and shame rising instinctively to close her throat. She had spent years learning that speaking up only invited punishment, that her voice mattered less than the convenience of those around her. But something about the way Damien watched her, patient and unwavering, made her believe that perhaps, for the first time, someone actually wanted to hear the truth. "I was accused of stealing something," she said quietly. "A pendant that belonged to the Alpha's late wife. I never took it. I never even saw it before it was found under my bed, but no one believed me. My stepmother had me thrown out of the pack house in the middle of the storm, and the elders sealed the gates behind me." Damien's expression grew darker with every word, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "And no one thought to question how a pendant that valuable ended up hidden in your room, when you claim you never touched it?" "No one wanted to question it," Elena said, an old bitterness creeping into her tone despite her efforts to remain composed. "I am an Omega from a family with no standing in the pack. It was easier to believe I was guilty than to consider that someone else might have placed it there." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a coldness settling over his features that Elena recognized instantly as the reputation she had heard whispered about for years. But this coldness, she realized, was not directed at her. It was directed at the injustice she had just described, at a pack that had so easily discarded one of its own without a second thought. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though no less intense. "Elena," she answered. "Elena Marsh." Damien repeated her name softly, as though testing the shape of it, and something in the way he said it made Elena's pulse quicken in a way she did not fully understand. "Elena," he said, "you will not be returning to that pack house. Not until I have determined exactly what happened to you, and who is responsible for leaving you to die in that storm." Elena blinked in surprise, uncertain how to respond to such a declaration. "Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly ask you to involve yourself in—" "You didn't ask," Damien interrupted, though not unkindly. "I am choosing to involve myself. I do not tolerate injustice within the territories under my protection. And what happened to you last night is exactly the kind of cruelty I intend to put an end to." He paused, studying her for a long moment before continuing. "You will stay here in the royal residence until this matter is properly investigated. You will be safe. No one will touch you again without answering to me first." The weight of his words settled over Elena slowly, disbelief warring with a fragile, hesitant hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She had expected pity, perhaps, or polite dismissal once her gratitude had been properly expressed. She had not expected this, a promise of protection from a man whose power could reshape the fate of an entire pack with a single command. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find any other words adequate to the moment. Damien's expression softened again, just slightly, the coldness in his eyes giving way to something quieter, something Elena could not yet name but felt drawn to in a way that unsettled her deeply. "Rest now," he said. You have been through enough for one night. We will speak more once you have recovered your strength. As Grace led her back toward the room where she would spend the next several days recovering, Elena found herself glancing back once toward the door, toward the man who had pulled her from the snow with his own hands, and now stood ready to challenge an entire pack on her behalf. She did not understand why he had done any of it, why a king with territories and armies and endless responsibilities had stopped his convoy for a stranger dying at the edge of the road. But as she settled back into the warm bed, the cloak still resting nearby where she had left it, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to believe that perhaps her life was not over after all. Perhaps it was only just beginning. 3 days had passed since Elena woke in the royal residence, and each morning she found herself waiting for someone to tell her it had all been a mistake, that she would be sent back to Blackwood territory to face whatever punishment awaited a runaway Omega accused of theft. But no such order came. Instead, she was given warm meals, clean clothes, and the strange, uncomfortable luxury of being asked what she needed, rather than being told what was expected of her. She was sitting near the window of her temporary chambers, watching servants move through the courtyard below, when a sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Edmund, the king's advisor, stood in the doorway when she opened it, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put her on edge. "His Majesty requests your presence," he said. "Investigators have returned from Blackwood territory with information regarding the matter you described." Elena's stomach tightened as she followed Edmund through the corridors toward the same study where she had first spoken with Damien. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Perhaps the investigators had found nothing, and she would be sent back regardless. Perhaps they had found evidence that somehow confirmed her guilt, planted so carefully that even the truth would not save her. When she entered the study, Damien stood near his desk, a folder of documents open before him, his expression unreadable in the way she was beginning to recognize as his default state when dealing with matters of importance. A second man stood nearby, someone she did not recognize, dressed in the dark uniform of the royal investigators. "Elena," Damien said, gesturing for her to sit in the chair positioned across from his desk. "This is Henry. He led the investigation into your circumstances at Blackwood territory. I thought it best you hear what he found directly." Elena sat carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Henry cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice steady and professional, in a way that somehow made the coming information feel even more significant. "We questioned several members of the household staff separately," Henry said, "along with 2 of the pack elders who oversaw your dismissal. Their stories did not align in several important details. When pressed further, one of the younger kitchen staff admitted, under assurance of protection, that she witnessed your stepsister Clara entering your room the night before the pendant was discovered." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much from the very beginning, but hearing it confirmed by someone outside her own desperate assumptions felt entirely different, both vindicating and infuriating at once. "Clara placed the pendant there herself," Henry continued. "It appears she had arranged a favorable match with the son of a neighboring pack alpha, one who required proof of her family's wealth and standing before finalizing the arrangement. Your stepmother, it seems, was aware of the scheme and allowed it to proceed, believing that removing you from the household would simplify matters considerably." Elena's hands trembled slightly in her lap, old anger rising in her chest alongside a strange, hollow grief for the family she had never truly had. She had always known her stepmother held little affection for her, but she had not fully understood, until this moment, just how easily she had been sacrificed for the sake of a marriage arrangement. "Why?" she asked quietly, though she was not entirely certain who she was asking. Henry or Damien, or simply the universe itself. Why would they go to such lengths? I was never a threat to anything they wanted. "You were an inconvenience," Damien said, his voice quiet but edged with the same barely restrained anger Elena had noticed during their first conversation. "An extra mouth to feed, an extra name that might complicate inheritance, or standing within the pack. Cruelty does not always require a grand motive, Elena. Sometimes it is simply the easiest path for those unwilling to consider anyone's comfort but their own." Henry shifted slightly, glancing between the 2 of them before continuing. "There is more, Your Majesty. The pack elders who approved Elena's dismissal did so without following proper procedure. No formal hearing was held. No opportunity was given for her to defend herself before the decision was made. Under the treaties governing pack conduct within your territories, this constitutes a clear violation." Damien's expression darkened further, though when he looked at Elena again, something in his eyes softened, as though he were deliberately separating the anger he felt toward Blackwood's leadership from whatever he wished to convey to her directly. "This changes things considerably," he said. The elders responsible for your dismissal will need to answer for their failure to follow proper conduct. Your stepmother and stepsister will need to answer for the false accusation itself. Elena felt a strange mixture of relief and unease settle over her. Part of her wanted nothing more than to see justice served, to watch the people who had cast her aside face consequences for their cruelty. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of being told her feelings mattered less than everyone else's convenience, worried about what it would mean to stand against an entire pack with only a king's protection standing between her and their retaliation. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you, in part," Damien said, surprising her with the consideration in his tone. "I could handle this matter through official channels, summoning the elders and your stepmother to answer for what was done to you before a formal tribunal. It would be a lengthy process, but a thorough one. Or, if you prefer, I could resolve the matter more directly, though I imagine you might find that approach uncomfortably swift given your circumstances." Elena considered his words carefully, aware that whatever she decided would shape not only her own future but the fate of people who had once held complete power over her life. "I want the truth to be known," she said finally. "Not just for my sake, but so that no one else in that pack has to fear being discarded the way I was. If a formal tribunal accomplishes that, then that is what I would prefer." Something flickered across Damien's face, an expression that looked almost like approval, though he said nothing about it directly. "Very well. Henry, arrange for a formal summons to be delivered to Blackwood territory. I want the elders responsible, along with Elena's stepmother and stepsister, present before the tribunal within the fortnight." Henry nodded and excused himself from the room, leaving Elena alone with Damien for the first time since their initial conversation days earlier. The silence between them stretched for a moment, neither quite certain how to fill it, until Damien finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, less formal than the tone he had used while discussing the investigation. "You handled that with more composure than most would manage," he said. "Learning that your own family conspired against you cannot have been easy to hear." Elena looked down at her hands, still folded tightly in her lap. "I think some part of me always suspected it," she admitted. "My stepmother never hid how she felt about me, not really. She simply never had a reason strong enough to act on it before now." "That does not make it easier," Damien said, and something in his tone told Elena he understood more about difficult family circumstances than his position as an all-powerful king might suggest. "May I ask you something?" Elena said, surprising herself with the boldness of the question, before she had fully considered whether it was appropriate to ask a king something so personal. Damien inclined his head slightly, giving her permission to continue. "Why did you stop for me?" she asked. "That night, in the storm. You are a king. You have entire territories depending on your attention. Why would you risk delaying your convoy, your schedule, everything, for someone you had never even met?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made Elena's pulse quicken despite herself. "I am not entirely certain I can explain it in a way that will make sense," he said finally. "My wolf sensed something that night. Something I have not felt in a very long time. I cannot claim it was simple compassion alone that made me stop the carriage, though compassion certainly played its part once I understood what I was looking at. There was something else as well, something I am still trying to understand myself." Elena did not press further, though the answer left her with more questions than it resolved. She found herself thinking, in the quiet moments before sleep each night since her arrival, about the strange pull she felt whenever Damien was near, an awareness of him that went beyond simple gratitude for having saved her life. She told herself it was merely the natural response of someone who had been rescued from certain death, an attachment born of relief rather than anything deeper. But some quiet part of her was beginning to suspect that explanation was not entirely honest. "Thank you," she said instead, "for believing me, for sending Henry to investigate it all when you had no obligation to do so. Everyone deserves the truth to be known," Damien said simply, "especially when the alternative is allowing cruelty to go unanswered simply because it was convenient for those in power to look away." As Elena rose to leave the study, Damien's voice stopped her at the door. "Elena," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her turn back to face him fully. "Whatever happens at the tribunal, whatever your stepmother and stepsister choose to say in their own defense, you will not be facing it alone. I will make certain of that." Elena nodded, unable to find words adequate to the strange warmth spreading through her chest at his promise, and left the study with a mind full of questions about the man who had saved her life, and now seemed determined to reshape the fate of everyone who had wronged her. Questions she suspected would take far longer than a fortnight to fully understand. The days leading up to the tribunal passed in a strange rhythm that Elena had never before experienced. one shaped by comfort rather than constant labor, by conversation rather than silence enforced through fear. She spent her mornings walking through the palace gardens with Grace, who had taken to checking on her recovery each day, and her afternoons, slowly growing more familiar with the vast library that occupied an entire wing of the royal residence. It was in that library, surrounded by shelves that stretched higher than she could reach without a ladder, that she encountered Damien more often than she expected. He would arrive in the late afternoon, usually with a stack of documents requiring his attention, and settle into a chair near the tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. At first, Elena kept her distance, uncertain of the boundaries appropriate between a rescued Omega and the king who had saved her. But as the days passed, the distance between them began to shrink in small, unremarkable ways that neither of them seemed to fully notice until it had already happened. "You read quickly," Damien observed one afternoon, glancing up from his own work to find Elena already 3 chapters into a book she had selected only an hour earlier. "I never had much opportunity to read growing up," Elena admitted, marking her place with a slip of ribbon before setting the book aside. The Pack Library at Blackwood was reserved for elders and their families. I taught myself using whatever books I could find discarded or forgotten in the kitchens. Something flickered across Damien's face, an expression Elena was beginning to recognize as quiet anger directed not at her, but at the circumstances she described so plainly, as though such treatment were simply an ordinary fact of her existence, rather than something worthy of outrage. "You are welcome to anything in this library," he said, "for as long as you wish to remain here." Elena felt a flush of warmth at his words, though she pushed the feeling aside quickly, reminding herself that gratitude and comfort were not the same as anything more significant. "Thank you," she said simply, returning her attention to the book before her, though she found it increasingly difficult to focus on the words when Damien remained nearby. Their conversations grew longer over the following days, expanding beyond simple pleasantries into discussions that revealed more of who each of them truly was beneath the roles they had been forced into by circumstance. Elena learned that Damien had become king at a devastatingly young age, forced to claim his throne through conflict after his father's sudden death left the territories vulnerable to rival packs eager to seize power. He spoke of it only briefly, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested old wounds still lingered beneath the surface, but Elena recognized something familiar in the careful way he guarded himself against vulnerability. In turn, she found herself sharing details of her own life that she had never spoken aloud to anyone, memories of her mother before illness took her, small moments of kindness from kitchen staff who had shown her quiet compassion even when open affection might have drawn unwanted attention from her stepmother. Damien listened with an attentiveness that surprised her, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and slowly, without either of them quite intending it, something began to shift between them. One evening, as autumn winds rattled softly against the library windows, Elena found herself laughing at something Damien had said, a rare moment of levity that seemed to catch them both off guard. Damien's expression softened as he watched her, something warm settling into his gray eyes that made Elena's heart quicken in a way she was no longer able to dismiss as simple gratitude. "You should laugh more often," Damien said quietly. "It suits you." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such a simple yet unexpectedly intimate observation. "I haven't had much reason to laugh, most of my life," she admitted. "It feels strange, being somewhere that allows for it." "You deserve far more than simply being allowed to laugh," Damien said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Elena's breath catch. "You deserve a life where joy is not something you must seek permission for." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them fully addressed, until a soft knock at the library door interrupted the silence, breaking the spell that had settled over the room. Edmund entered with a stack of papers requiring Damien's immediate attention, and the moment passed, though Elena found herself thinking about it long after she had returned to her own chambers that night, replaying the warmth in Damien's voice, the way his eyes had lingered on her face, as though searching for something he had not expected to find. 2 days before the tribunal was scheduled to begin, Elena took a walk through the palace gardens alone, needing space to gather her thoughts before facing the people who had once controlled every aspect of her existence. The garden paths wound between carefully maintained hedges and late-blooming flowers that somehow still held color despite the encroaching cold, and Elena found a quiet bench near a small fountain where she could sit undisturbed with her thoughts. She had not expected to encounter anyone else there, and was startled when a young woman approached from the opposite path, dressed in the simple uniform of palace staff, her expression hesitant, as though uncertain whether she was permitted to speak. "Forgive me," the young woman said. You are Elena, are you not, the one His Majesty rescued from the storm? Elena nodded cautiously, uncertain what to expect from the encounter. I am. May I help you with something? The young woman glanced around the garden briefly, as though checking for anyone who might overhear, before continuing. My name is Margaret. I served briefly at Blackwood Territory before transferring to the royal residence last year. I wanted to tell you, if it means anything, that I always suspected something was wrong with how you were treated there. I never had the courage to say anything at the time, and I am sorry for that. Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions rise within her. Gratitude for the woman's honesty tangled with old bitterness, for the silence that had allowed her suffering to continue unchecked. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I understand how difficult it can be to speak against those with power over your livelihood. Margaret's expression shifted, something almost like relief crossing her features at Elena's understanding response. I wanted you to know that not everyone at Blackwood agreed with how you were treated. Some of us simply lacked the courage to say so at the time it mattered most. After Margaret departed, Elena remained on the bench for a long while, considering the strange comfort of knowing that even within the pack that had cast her aside, some small measure of sympathy had existed, however silent and ineffective it had ultimately been. It did not undo the harm she had suffered, but it offered a small reminder that cruelty, however widespread it seemed, was never truly universal. She was still lost in thought when Damien found her there, his approach quiet enough that she did not notice him until he settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool evening air. You seem troubled, he observed. Elena shared her conversation with Margaret, watching Damien's expression carefully as she spoke, curious how he might respond to the idea that some within Blackwood Territory had harbored quiet sympathy even while remaining silent. His reaction surprised her, a thoughtful consideration rather than the anger she might have expected. Silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of failure, Damien said, but I understand the fear that breeds such silence better than most might expect. Fear of losing one's position, one's safety, one's place within a community that offers few alternatives. It does not excuse the failure, but it explains it. Do you think people can change? Elena asked, even after allowing such cruelty to continue unchecked for so long. Damien considered the question seriously before answering. I believe people are capable of change when given the right circumstances, and enough courage to act upon their better instincts. Whether Blackwood as a whole deserves that opportunity remains to be seen. The tribunal will reveal much about who among them is willing to take responsibility, and who prefers to continue hiding behind convenient excuses. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the last light of evening fade beyond the garden hedges, until Damien spoke again, his voice quieter now, more hesitant than Elena had yet heard from him. Elena, I want you to know that whatever happens during the tribunal, whatever you learn about the people who wronged you, you have already proven yourself far stronger than anyone in that pack ever gave you credit for. Elena turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his gray eyes, and found herself unable to look away. I would not have survived any of this without you, she said softly. I am not certain I know how to properly thank you for everything you have done. You do not need to thank me, Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper now, the distance between them somehow having shrunk without either of them quite noticing when it happened. Simply being here, watching you grow stronger each day, is more than enough. The moment stretched between them, charged with an intensity that left Elena's heart pounding, until the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path broke the spell, and both of them straightened slightly, though neither moved fully away from the other. Whatever was growing between them, Elena realized, was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and she suspected that the coming tribunal would not be the only significant turning point awaiting her in the days ahead. The great hall of the royal residence had been transformed for the tribunal, rows of seating arranged before a raised platform, where Damien would preside over the proceedings alongside two senior judges brought in from neighboring territories to ensure impartiality. Elena stood near a side entrance, her hands trembling despite the confidence she tried to project, watching as members of Blackwood Pack filed into the hall under careful guard. She saw her stepmother first, Vivian, dressed in a gown far too elegant for the circumstances, her expression carrying the same cold composure Elena remembered from years of living beneath her roof. Beside her walked Clara, Elena's stepsister, whose eyes darted nervously around the grand hall, betraying an anxiety that Vivian's practiced calm managed to conceal entirely. Elena felt Grace's hand settle gently on her shoulder, a small gesture of support that helped steady her nerves as the proceedings began. Damien took his seat at the center of the raised platform, his expression carrying none of the warmth Elena had grown accustomed to seeing in their private conversations. replaced instead by the cold authority of a king presiding over judgment. This tribunal is called to address serious allegations of injustice within Blackwood territory, Damien announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. Specifically, the false accusation and subsequent expulsion of Elena Marsh, an Omega under the protection of these territories, during conditions that nearly resulted in her death. Henry rose to present the evidence gathered during his investigation, methodically laying out the testimony of kitchen staff who had witnessed Clara entering Elena's room the night before the pendant's discovery, along with documentation showing the arranged marriage that had motivated the scheme. Elena watched Clara's composure crack slightly as the evidence mounted, her eyes flicking nervously toward her mother as though seeking guidance on how to respond. When it came time for Vivian to speak in her own defense, she rose with practiced grace, her voice carrying the same cool authority Elena remembered from countless conversations that had left her feeling small and unwanted. Your Majesty, I understand the evidence presented appears damning, but I must stress that any decisions made regarding Elena's dismissal were made with the pack's best interests in mind. She was never formally part of our family by blood, and questions had long existed regarding her suitability within our household. Elena felt old wounds reopening at her stepmother's casual dismissal of her humanity. The same careless cruelty she had endured for years now displayed openly before an audience of judges and nobility. But this time, unlike every previous instance, someone with real power was listening, and his expression had grown colder with every word Vivian spoke. Suitability, Damien repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made several nobles in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. You are suggesting that a young woman's supposed lack of suitability justified expelling her into a winter storm, with full knowledge that she would likely die from exposure? Vivian's composure faltered slightly under the weight of his direct question. I did not personally expel her, Your Majesty. The decision was made collectively by the pack elders following the discovery of stolen property. Property that your own daughter placed in Elena's room, Damien said, his voice sharpening now. Evidence gathered by my own investigators confirms this. Are you suggesting you had no knowledge of your daughter's scheme? Clara's nervous composure finally broke entirely under the mounting pressure, her voice trembling as she rose from her seat despite her mother's warning glance. I never meant for her to die, Clara said, tears filling her eyes, as the weight of the situation finally seemed to register fully. I only wanted her removed from the household long enough to secure my marriage arrangement. I never imagined she would be left outside during such a severe storm. I thought she would simply be sent to stay with distant relatives. And yet you allowed her to be expelled directly into the storm without raising any objection, Damien said, knowing full well the accusation against her was false. Clara had no response to offer, her silence speaking volumes that her earlier composure had tried desperately to conceal. The hall remained quiet as Damien turned his attention back to Vivian, whose expression had grown noticeably paler as the full weight of the tribunal's findings settled over the assembled crowd. The evidence before this tribunal is clear, Damien announced finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Elena Marsh was falsely accused of theft through a scheme orchestrated by her stepsister, with the knowledge and tacit approval of her stepmother. She was expelled from Blackwood territory without proper hearing or opportunity to defend herself, in direct violation of the treaties governing conduct within these territories, and left to face conditions that very nearly resulted in her death. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the silent hall before continuing. Vivian Marsh, you are hereby stripped of any remaining standing within Blackwood territory and banished from these lands entirely. Clara Marsh, given your youth and the eventual acknowledgement of your wrongdoing, you will face a period of supervised service within a neighboring territory, working directly to support those in circumstances similar to the one you nearly condemned your stepsister to suffer. The judgment fell over the hall like a physical weight, and Elena watched with a complicated mixture of emotions as her stepmother's face contorted with shock and barely restrained fury, while Clara simply wept. Whether from genuine remorse or fear of the consequences now facing her, Elena could not entirely determine. Damien's attention then turned to the pack elders who had approved Elena's dismissal without proper procedure, his expression remaining coldly authoritative as he addressed their failures directly. The elders responsible for approving Elena's expulsion without formal hearing have demonstrated a clear disregard for the protections owed to every individual within these territories, regardless of their standing within pack hierarchy. Effective immediately, all three elders involved are removed from their positions, and Blackwood territory will undergo formal review to ensure such failures of justice do not occur again. As the tribunal concluded and guards began escorting the condemned parties from the hall, Elena felt Grace's hand tighten supportively on her shoulder, though her own attention remained fixed on Damien, who had risen from his seat and was making his way toward her through the dispersing crowd. "It is done," he said quietly once he reached her side, his cold authority softening back into the warmth Elena had grown accustomed to during their private conversations. "You do not have to fear returning to that pack, not while I remain in power. The truth has been acknowledged, and those responsible have faced consequences for their actions." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from relief, lingering grief, or some combination of both, she could not entirely say. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never imagined I would live to see this day." "You deserve justice," Damien said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. As they stood together amid the slowly emptying hall, Elena found herself acutely aware of how close Damien stood beside her, of the warmth in his gray eyes as he studied her face, searching for something beyond simple relief at the tribunal's conclusion. Whatever connection had been building between them during the quiet evenings in the library and garden had only grown stronger through the events of this difficult day, and Elena suspected that neither of them could continue pretending it was simply gratitude any longer. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, an old fear lingered beneath the surface, a quiet voice reminding her of every lesson she had learned throughout her life about her own worth, about the impossibility of someone like her ever truly belonging in a world as grand and powerful as the one Damien occupied. The tribunal had granted her justice, but Elena wondered whether it had truly granted her the ability to believe, fully and completely, that she deserved the growing warmth she felt whenever Damien was near. In the weeks following the tribunal, Elena settled into a rhythm within the royal residence that felt more like belonging than anything she had experienced in her entire life. She had been given her own chambers, modest by royal standards but grander than anything she had known at Blackwood, and had slowly begun taking on small responsibilities within the household, assisting Grace with organizing the healing quarters and helping catalog the vast collection of books within the palace library. Damien sought her company often, their conversations growing easier and more natural with each passing day, though neither of them had yet spoken directly about the growing warmth clearly building between them. Elena told herself this was simply how gratitude and friendship developed over time, though the quickening of her pulse whenever Damien entered a room suggested her feelings ran considerably deeper than simple friendship. It was during a formal dinner hosted for visiting nobility from a neighboring territory that Elena first encountered the sharper edges of court life, the whispers and judgmental glances that reminded her, painfully, of exactly how far removed she remained from the world Damien occupied by birthright. She had been seated near the far end of the long dining table, a placement that already spoke volumes about her perceived standing among the assembled guests, when she overheard two noblewomen speaking in hushed tones, just loud enough for her to catch every word. "I hear she was found half dead in the snow," one woman murmured, her voice carrying just enough disdain to make her meaning unmistakable. "An Omega from some minor pack, no standing whatsoever. It's difficult to imagine why His Majesty continues to keep her so close." "Pity, perhaps," the second woman replied, "though one wonders how long his patience for charity cases will last, particularly once more suitable prospects for his attention present themselves." Elena felt her face flush with humiliation, old insecurities rising sharply to the surface, despite months of growing confidence within the palace walls. She excused herself quietly from the table, unable to bear the continued proximity to conversations that so casually reduced her survival and recovery to nothing more than a temporary charitable indulgence on Damien's part. She made her way to the palace gardens, seeking the quiet solitude that had become her refuge during difficult moments, and sat heavily on the same bench where she and Damien had shared their conversation weeks earlier. The autumn air had grown considerably colder now, winter approaching steadily, and Elena wrapped her arms around herself as old doubts flooded back with renewed force. Perhaps the noblewomen were right. Perhaps she truly was nothing more than a temporary distraction for a king whose genuine interests would inevitably turn toward women of proper standing, women born into families capable of offering political advantage rather than complicated histories of abuse and cruelty. She had allowed herself to hope for something more during the past weeks, had allowed herself to believe that perhaps she deserved the warmth and kindness Damien had shown her, but sitting alone in the cold evening air, that hope felt suddenly fragile and foolish. She did not hear Damien's approach until he was already settling onto the bench beside her, his expression immediately shifting to concern as he took in her troubled demeanor. "Edmund told me you left the dinner early," he said. "Is something wrong?" Elena hesitated, uncertain whether to share the painful conversation she had overheard, worried that voicing such insecurities aloud would somehow make them more real, more permanent. But something in Damien's steady gaze encouraged honesty, and slowly, haltingly, she shared what she had overheard. Damien's expression darkened as she spoke, though his anger seemed directed entirely at the noblewomen's cruelty rather than at Elena for sharing such vulnerable feelings. "Their opinions mean nothing," he said firmly once she had finished. "You are not a charity case, Elena. You never have been." "But they aren't entirely wrong, are they?" Elena said, old bitterness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. "I have no standing, no family wealth, no political advantage to offer someone in your position. Whatever this is between us, whatever I have allowed myself to hope for, it cannot possibly make sense given everything I lack." "Do you believe your worth is measured by wealth or political standing?" Damien asked quietly, turning to face her fully now, his gray eyes carrying an intensity that made Elena's breath catch despite her lingering doubts. "I have spent my entire life being told exactly that," Elena admitted. "That my worth is measured by usefulness, by convenience, by how little trouble I cause for those with actual power over my circumstances. It is difficult to unlearn something so deeply ingrained, even here, even with everything you have done for me." Damien reached out slowly, giving Elena ample opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand in his own, his thumb brushing softly across her knuckles in a gesture that felt far more intimate than anything they had shared before. "I have ruled these territories since I was barely more than a boy," he said quietly. "I have met countless nobles, countless women whose families sought advantageous matches through my throne, and none of them, not a single one, ever made me feel the way I feel whenever you are near." Elena's heart pounded at his words, uncertain whether to trust the warmth spreading through her chest, or dismiss it as simply another form of the old hope she feared would inevitably lead to disappointment. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I mean that from the moment my wolf sensed your heartbeat in that storm, something in me recognized you as significant, in a way I cannot fully explain through simple gratitude or compassion alone," Damien said. "I have tried to attribute my feelings to relief at having saved a life, to simple friendship born from proximity, but I no longer believe either explanation captures what I feel when I am with you." Elena's breath caught entirely, hope and fear warring within her chest, as she searched Damien's expression for any hint of uncertainty, any sign that his words were merely comfort offered in a difficult moment, rather than genuine feeling. But his gray eyes held nothing but sincerity, steady and unwavering despite the vulnerability his admission clearly required. "I am afraid," Elena admitted quietly, "of allowing myself to believe something that seems too significant to be real. I have spent so long being told I deserve so little that it feels almost dangerous to hope for something as significant as what you are describing." "I understand that fear," Damien said gently, "but I promise you, Elena, whatever grows between us will not be built on convenience or temporary charity. If you are willing to trust that promise, I am willing to prove it to you, for as long as it takes for you to fully believe it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, Damien's hand still holding hers, the cold evening air no longer feeling quite so isolating with his steady presence beside her. Elena did not have an answer yet for the questions swirling through her mind, questions about worth and belonging, and whether someone with her history could truly find lasting happiness within a world built for people of standing and privilege. But for the first time since overhearing those cruel whispers at dinner, she allowed herself to believe, cautiously and tentatively, that perhaps Damien's feelings were genuine, and perhaps, given time, she might learn to believe she deserved them. As they eventually rose to return to the warmth of the palace, Damien paused, turning to face her fully one final time before they parted ways for the evening. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever doubts continue to trouble you, know that I am not going anywhere. Whatever time you need to trust what is growing between us, I intend to remain steady throughout all of it." Elena nodded, unable to find adequate words to respond to such a sincere promise, and made her way back toward her chambers with a heart considerably lighter than it had been at the start of the evening, though the old insecurities Damien had addressed so gently would not disappear entirely. Not yet. Not after so many years of being taught to believe otherwise. Winter arrived in full force over the following weeks, blanketing the palace grounds in thick layers of snow that transformed the gardens into a landscape of quiet white beauty, though Elena found herself unable to look at fresh snowfall without a flicker of the old fear that had nearly claimed her life months earlier. Damien had noticed this reaction during their walks together, the way she tensed slightly whenever heavy snow began to fall, and had taken to ensuring she remained warmly dressed and accompanied whenever weather turned severe. Despite the progress they had made since their conversation in the garden, Elena continued to struggle with moments of doubt that seemed to arrive without warning, triggered by the smallest reminders of her former life. A particularly difficult moment arrived during a formal gathering held to celebrate the arrival of the winter solstice. an event that drew nobility from across all 5 territories to the royal residence for several days of festivities. Elena had been given a beautiful gown for the occasion, deep green fabric that Grace insisted complemented her coloring perfectly, and had spent considerable time that afternoon trying to convince herself she belonged among the elegant guests gathering in the great hall. But as she entered the celebration on Damien's arm, feeling countless eyes turned toward her with expressions ranging from curious to openly disdainful, old insecurities rose sharply within her chest. "You look beautiful," Damien murmured as they made their way through the crowd, though his words did little to ease the anxious tightness in Elena's stomach, as she noticed several nobles exchanging pointed glances at her presence beside the king. The evening progressed with the usual formalities of such gatherings, dancing and conversation flowing throughout the great hall, though Elena remained acutely aware of the whispered comments following her wherever she moved. It was during a brief moment when Damien had been pulled away to discuss matters of territorial trade with a visiting alpha that Elena found herself approached by a woman she did not recognize, dressed in elegant furs that clearly marked her as nobility of considerable standing. "You must be the Omega everyone has been discussing," the woman said, her tone carrying a false sweetness that immediately put Elena on guard. "I am Lady Iris, from the Eastern Territories. I understand you were quite fortunate that His Majesty happened to be passing through when he found you." "I was," Elena agreed carefully, uncertain where the conversation was heading but sensing nothing good would come from it. "It must be difficult," Lady Iris continued, her voice dropping slightly as though sharing a confidence, "adjusting to life here, given everything you came from. I have heard whispers that your own family cast you out, that you had no standing whatsoever within your former pack. It speaks well of His Majesty's generous nature that he continues to extend such patience toward you." Elena felt the familiar sting of humiliation rising within her chest, though she forced herself to maintain composure despite the deliberate cruelty hidden within Lady Iris's seemingly polite observations. "His Majesty's kindness has indeed been significant," Elena replied carefully, "though I would not describe our relationship as one requiring patience on his part." Lady Iris's smile sharpened slightly at Elena's measured response. "Of course not," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Though surely you understand that a king's attention, however genuine it may feel in private moments, must eventually turn toward matters of proper succession and alliance. I imagine it would be quite painful to allow yourself too much hope, given the realities of what a king truly requires from someone who might share his throne." The words struck Elena with precise, calculated cruelty, awakening every fear she had struggled to overcome during her conversations with Damien in the garden. Before she could formulate a response, however, she felt a familiar presence at her side, and turned to find Damien had returned, his expression cold as he addressed Lady Iris directly. "Lady Iris," he said, his voice carrying an edge that immediately silenced the surrounding conversation among nearby guests who had been listening with poorly concealed interest. "I believe you were just leaving." Lady Iris's composure faltered slightly under Damien's obvious displeasure, though she recovered quickly, offering a shallow curtsy before retreating into the crowd without further comment. Damien turned immediately to Elena, his expression softening with concern as he studied her clearly troubled features. "I apologize for not returning sooner," he said quietly. "What did she say to you?" Elena hesitated, uncertain whether voicing Lady Iris's cruel words aloud would somehow lend them additional weight, but Damien's steady, patient expression encouraged her honesty. She repeated the conversation quietly, watching his expression grow increasingly troubled as she spoke. "None of that is true," Damien said firmly once she had finished. "My feelings for you are not some passing indulgence that will fade once political considerations demand otherwise. I have made my intentions regarding succession considerably clearer to my council than perhaps I have made clear to you, and I intend to remedy that oversight very soon." Elena's heart pounded at his words, uncertain exactly what he meant but sensing something significant in his tone. Before she could ask for clarification, however, a commotion near the entrance of the great hall drew everyone's attention, guards moving quickly to address what appeared to be an unexpected disturbance. A messenger, breathless from apparent urgency, made his way directly toward Damien, bowing quickly before delivering his message in hushed tones that Elena could not fully hear. Damien's expression shifted immediately from concern to sharp alertness, his entire posture changing as he processed whatever information the messenger had delivered. "What is it?" Elena asked, sensing the sudden tension radiating from him. "A delegation from the Southern Territories has arrived unexpectedly," Damien said, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration at the interruption. "Alpha Victor claims urgent matters require immediate discussion. I need to address this directly." Elena watched as Damien's expression hardened into the cold authority she recognized from the tribunal weeks earlier, and felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her despite the reassurances he had just offered regarding his feelings and intentions. Whatever urgent matter had brought Alpha Victor to the palace unannounced during the winter solstice celebration, Elena sensed instinctively that it would not prove to be simple or easily resolved. "Stay close to Grace," Damien instructed, his tone carrying gentle concern despite the urgency clearly weighing on him. "I will return as soon as I am able, but I have a feeling this discussion may take considerable time." Elena nodded, watching as Damien made his way toward a private chamber adjoining the Great Hall. Alpha Victor's imposing figure visible briefly through the parted crowd before the door closed behind them both. She remained near Grace for the following hour, unable to fully enjoy the continuing festivities, as anxiety about the unexpected delegation weighed increasingly heavy on her thoughts. When Damien finally emerged from the private discussion, his expression carried a grim tension that immediately confirmed Elena's earlier instincts. He made his way directly toward her, his gray eyes carrying a protective intensity she had not seen from him previously. "Elena," he said quietly, drawing her slightly away from the surrounding crowd, "Alpha Victor has learned of the tribunal's outcome regarding Blackwood territory, and more specifically, of my personal involvement in your circumstances. He has expressed concerning interest in your situation, suggesting that an Omega without proper pack standing represents a vulnerability he intends to exploit for his own political advantage." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the Great Hall, sensing that whatever protection and belonging she had begun to believe in during her months at the palace was about to be tested in ways she had not yet imagined. "What does he intend to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's expression grew even more serious, his hand finding hers protectively as he answered, "I am not entirely certain yet, but I do not intend to allow him the opportunity to find out. Whatever Alpha Victor believes he can accomplish by targeting you, Elena, he will discover very quickly that I do not tolerate threats against those under my protection." The winter solstice celebration continued around them, oblivious to the quiet tension now settling between Elena and Damien. But for the first time since her arrival at the palace, Elena understood clearly that her survival of that terrible storm had not been the end of her difficulties, but rather the beginning of challenges far more complex than she had ever anticipated facing. The days following the winter solstice celebration passed with a tension that settled over the palace like a heavy fog, everyone from the household staff to the highest-ranking advisors aware that something significant had shifted since Alpha Victor's unexpected arrival. Elena found herself unable to shake the unease that had taken root since Damien's revelation, watching the palace corridors with new wariness despite the guards who had quietly increased their presence around her chambers. She was walking through the eastern corridor toward the library one afternoon when she first sensed something was wrong, an unfamiliar prickling awareness crawling across her skin that made her pause mid-step. She had learned, during her months at the palace, to trust the instincts that had once kept her alive during years of navigating her stepmother's cruelty, and those instincts were now screaming that danger lurked somewhere nearby. A figure emerged from a side corridor before she could act on her unease, a man she did not recognize, dressed in clothing that marked him as part of the southern delegation that had arrived alongside Alpha Victor. His expression carried a calculated calm that immediately set Elena further on edge, every instinct urging her to retreat toward more populated areas of the palace. "Elena Marsh," the man said, his voice smooth in a way that felt deliberately unsettling. "Alpha Victor requests a private conversation with you. He believes there is much you might benefit from understanding about your current circumstances." "I have no interest in speaking privately with Alpha Victor," Elena said firmly, backing away slowly while keeping her eyes fixed on the stranger. "If he wishes to discuss anything with me, he may do so through proper channels, with His Majesty present." The man's expression shifted slightly, something colder emerging beneath his previously calm demeanor. "That would rather defeat the purpose of the conversation Alpha Victor intends to have, I'm afraid." Elena's heart began racing as the man took a step closer, and she quickly assessed her surroundings, calculating the distance to the nearest occupied room where guards or staff might hear if she called for help. Before she could act, however, the sound of firm footsteps echoed from the opposite end of the corridor, and Damien's voice cut through the tense silence with an authority that made the stranger freeze instantly. "Step away from her," Damien commanded, his gray eyes carrying a dangerous intensity as he strode toward them, several guards materializing from side corridors at his signal. The stranger's composure cracked immediately under Damien's obvious fury, and he retreated several steps, hands raised in a gesture of false innocence. "Your Majesty, I was simply delivering a message from Alpha Victor, nothing more." Alpha Victor has no business approaching anyone under my protection without going through proper diplomatic channels, Damien said, his voice carrying a coldness that made even the surrounding guards shift uncomfortably. You will return to your delegation immediately, and you will inform Alpha Victor that any further attempts to approach Elena directly will be considered a violation of the treaties governing his territory's relationship with mine. The stranger departed quickly, clearly eager to escape Damien's obvious displeasure, leaving Elena trembling slightly in the aftermath of the confrontation. Damien turned to her immediately, his expression softening from fury to concern as he reached for her hands, checking for any sign of harm. "Are you unhurt?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger at what had nearly occurred. "I am fine," Elena assured him, though her voice betrayed the lingering fear still coursing through her. "He did not touch me. But Damien, why would Alpha Victor risk sending someone to approach me directly, especially after your warning during our earlier conversation?" Damien's expression darkened further, and he guided her toward a private sitting room nearby, ensuring the door was securely closed before he answered. "Alpha Victor has grown ambitious in recent months, seeking to expand his territorial influence through whatever means available to him. He believes that targeting you, an Omega, without established pack protection prior to my intervention, represents a vulnerability in my rule that he might exploit to weaken my standing among the other territories." "How could my circumstances possibly weaken your standing?" Elena asked, confusion mixing with her lingering fear. Damien hesitated before answering, his expression carrying a reluctance that told Elena the explanation was more complicated than she had initially anticipated. "There are those among the territorial alphas who believe a king's personal attachments should never take precedence over political alliance and proper succession planning. Alpha Victor intends to use your circumstances, your lack of formal pack standing prior to your rescue, as evidence that my judgment has become clouded by personal feelings rather than proper strategic consideration." Elena felt her chest tighten at his words, old fears resurfacing with renewed intensity. "Perhaps he is not entirely wrong," she said quietly. "Perhaps my presence here truly does create vulnerabilities you cannot afford, given everything at stake for your territories." "Do not say that," Damien said firmly, his hands tightening gently around hers. "Alpha Victor's ambitions have nothing to do with your worth, Elena, and everything to do with his own desire to weaken my position for his personal gain. I refuse to allow his manipulations to convince you otherwise." Before Elena could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Edmund entered with visible urgency, his expression carrying news that clearly would not wait. "Your Majesty, Alpha Victor has requested an immediate audience. He claims to possess information regarding a threat to territorial stability that requires your urgent attention." Damien's jaw tightened with obvious frustration, though he rose immediately, years of duty overriding his personal concerns despite the tension of the moment. "I need to address this directly," he told Elena, "but I want you to remain here, with guards posted at every entrance. I will not risk Alpha Victor attempting another approach while my attention is occupied elsewhere." Elena nodded, though anxiety continued churning within her chest as Damien departed alongside Edmund, leaving her alone with her worried thoughts in the quiet sitting room. She paced restlessly for what felt like hours, though the clock on the mantel indicated barely 20 minutes had passed, before the door opened again, revealing Grace's familiar, concerned expression. "I heard what happened in the corridor," Grace said, moving quickly to Elena's side. "Are you truly unharmed?" "I am fine," Elena assured her, though her voice still carried traces of lingering unease. "But Grace, I do not understand what Alpha Victor hopes to accomplish through all of this. What could he possibly gain by threatening me?" Grace's expression grew thoughtful, considering her words carefully before responding. "Alpha Victor has long harbored ambitions beyond his own territory's boundaries. There have been whispers for years that he seeks greater influence over the councils that advise His Majesty, perhaps even aspirations toward the throne itself, should circumstances ever create sufficient instability. Your presence here, and His Majesty's clear devotion to your well-being, represents precisely the kind of circumstance he might attempt to exploit." Elena absorbed this information with growing dread, understanding now more fully the complicated political currents her rescue had inadvertently pulled her into. "I never wanted to become a source of conflict," she said quietly. "I only wanted to survive that storm." "None of this is your doing," Grace said firmly, echoing Damien's earlier reassurance. "Alpha Victor's ambitions existed long before you arrived at this palace. You are simply the most recent circumstance he believes he can exploit for his own purposes." They waited together for Damien's return, the tension in the room gradually easing as the hours passed without further incident. When Damien finally returned, considerably later than Elena had anticipated. His expression carried the weary satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated a difficult confrontation, though the underlying tension had not entirely dissipated from his posture. Alpha Victor has been informed, in no uncertain terms, that any further attempts to target you will result in immediate and severe consequences for his territory, Damien said once Grace had discreetly excused herself, leaving them alone once more. He has withdrawn his delegation for now, though I suspect this will not be the last we hear from him. Elena felt a measure of relief at his words, though the underlying threat of Alpha Victor's ambitions continued weighing heavily on her thoughts. What happens now? She asked. Damien moved closer, his expression softening as he studied her face carefully. Now, I intend to ensure that no one, whether Alpha Victor or any other ambitious rival, ever again has grounds to question your place within these walls, or within my life. He paused, something significant flickering across his expression before he continued. Elena, there is something I have been considering for some time now, something I believe will settle any remaining questions about your standing here, once and for all. Elena's heart pounded at the seriousness in his tone, uncertain what significant declaration he intended to make, but sensing that whatever came next would irrevocably alter the course of everything that had unfolded since that terrible night in the storm. Elena barely slept that night, Damien's unfinished words echoing through her mind long after they had parted ways for the evening, his expression carrying a weight of significance she had not yet fully understood. He had promised to explain everything the following morning, insisting the matter deserved proper consideration rather than a hurried conversation following such an exhausting day. But the anticipation left Elena restless throughout the long hours before dawn. When morning finally arrived, Elena found herself summoned not to the library or garden where their private conversations usually occurred, but to the formal council chamber where Damien conducted the most significant matters of state. Her nervousness increased considerably upon entering the room, finding not only Damien present but also Edmund, Grace, and several senior advisors whose expressions carried a gravity that immediately signaled the importance of whatever discussion awaited. Elena, Damien said, rising from his seat as she entered, his gray eyes carrying warmth despite the formal atmosphere of the chamber. Thank you for coming. There is something significant I need to discuss with you, something that has become increasingly clear to me since the night I first found you in that storm. Elena took the seat offered to her, glancing uncertainly at the assembled advisors, whose expressions ranged from carefully neutral to openly curious as they awaited whatever Damien intended to reveal. What is this about? She asked. Damien took a moment to gather his thoughts before continuing, his expression carrying an unusual vulnerability for a man accustomed to commanding absolute authority. When my wolf first sensed your heartbeat in that storm, months ago, I attributed the intensity of that reaction to simple instinct, to the natural response of any alpha encountering someone in mortal danger. I did not fully understand, at the time, the true significance of what I was experiencing. Elena's breath caught slightly, sensing the direction of his words before he fully articulated them. Old stories about fated bonds between wolves surfacing from memories of tales shared during her childhood, before her mother's death had left her alone with a family incapable of such warmth. In recent weeks, Damien continued, particularly during the confrontation with Alpha Victor's delegate, my wolf's reaction toward any perceived threat against you has grown increasingly intense, far beyond what simple protective instinct alone would explain. I consulted with our pack's most experienced healers regarding this reaction, and their conclusion, one I confess I suspected but resisted acknowledging fully, is that you are my fated mate. The words settled over the chamber with significant weight, and Elena felt her heart racing as the full implications of Damien's revelation began to register. Fated mates were spoken of in old stories, bonds considered exceedingly rare even among wolves, representing a connection so profound that most who experienced it considered themselves fortunate beyond measure. She had never imagined, not once during her difficult life, that such a bond might exist for someone like her. Are you certain? Elena managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The healers confirmed it through examination of the bond markers present within both our systems, Damien said, his voice carrying quiet certainty despite the momentousness of his words. I am as certain as anyone can be regarding such matters. Elena, you are my fated mate, and I believe, given everything that has grown between us these past months, that this bond explains far more about my actions that stormy night than simple chance ever could. Elena absorbed this revelation slowly, memories flooding back of every moment since her rescue, the inexplicable pull she had felt toward Damien from their very first conversation, the warmth that had grown steadily despite her every effort to attribute it to simple gratitude rather than something far more significant. "This changes everything," she said quietly, uncertain whether the statement reflected fear or wonder, or some complicated combination of both. "It confirms what I believe we have both been feeling," Damien said gently, "though I understand this revelation carries significant implications beyond simply confirming our personal connection. A fated bond, once acknowledged publicly, cannot be dismissed by rivals like Alpha Victor as mere personal indulgence or temporary infatuation. It represents a bond recognized by wolf tradition as profound and unbreakable." One of the senior advisors, an older woman Elena recognized as having served on the council for many years, spoke up carefully. "Your Majesty, while the significance of a fated bond is certainly undeniable, we must also consider the practical implications of formally acknowledging this connection publicly. Alpha Victor and others of similar ambition may attempt to challenge the legitimacy of such claims, particularly given Elena's circumstances prior to her rescue. Any challenge to a properly verified fated bond would require evidence far beyond what Alpha Victor or any other rival could possibly produce," Damien responded firmly. "The healers have confirmed the bond markers through established methods recognized across all 5 territories. This is not a matter open to political manipulation." Elena listened to this exchange with growing understanding of the true weight of what was being decided within this formal chamber, recognizing that Damien's revelation was not simply a private declaration of feeling, but a formal matter of state that would reshape her entire position within the territories he ruled. The realization left her simultaneously overwhelmed and, for the first time since arriving at the palace, genuinely secure in a way she had never before experienced. "What happens now?" Elena asked, addressing both Damien and the assembled advisors, though her eyes remained fixed on Damien's steady gaze. "Now," Damien said, rising from his seat and moving to kneel before her chair, a gesture that immediately drew surprised murmurs from the assembled advisors, "I intend to formally acknowledge our bond before the full court, ensuring that no rival, whether Alpha Victor or anyone else, ever again has grounds to question your rightful place beside me." He took her hands gently in his own, his gray eyes carrying a sincerity that left no room for doubt regarding the genuine nature of his feelings. "Elena Marsh, from the moment I found you in that storm, something within me recognized you as significant beyond simple chance. I understand now that recognition was the beginning of a bond that wolf tradition considers among the most sacred connections possible between 2 people. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would accept this bond formally, and allow me to protect and cherish you not simply as someone under my care, but as my true and rightful mate." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelming emotion finally breaking through months of careful restraint and lingering doubt about her own worthiness for the happiness now being offered so sincerely before her. She thought of the girl who had nearly died in that storm, convinced that no one in the world valued her existence enough to notice her absence, and marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed since that terrible night. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but carrying absolute certainty despite the momentousness of the decision. "Yes, I accept this bond, Damien. I accept everything it means, for both of us." The chamber erupted into a mixture of relieved murmurs and quiet celebration among the assembled advisors, though Elena barely noticed the reaction of anyone beyond Damien himself, whose expression had transformed into genuine joy unlike anything she had witnessed from him previously. He rose from his kneeling position and drew her gently into an embrace, the formal chamber fading into insignificance as the true weight of their acknowledged bond settled over both of them. "There is still the matter of formal announcement before the full court," Edmund interjected gently once the emotional moment had settled slightly, though his tone carried genuine warmth despite the practical concern. "Alpha Victor and other territorial representatives should be informed of this development as swiftly as possible, to prevent any further attempts at manipulation regarding Elena's standing." "Then we shall arrange the formal announcement immediately," Damien said, though his gaze remained fixed on Elena, his expression carrying a warmth she suspected would remain long after the practical matters of court politics had been properly addressed. "Elena Marsh will be formally acknowledged not simply as my fated mate, but as future queen of these territories, with all rights and protections such standing entails." Elena felt the weight of this new title settle over her, momentous and slightly overwhelming, but for the first time since that terrible night in the storm, she found herself facing the future not with fear or uncertain hope, but with genuine confidence that whatever challenges remained ahead, she would face them not alone, but bonded irrevocably to a man who had proven, time and again, that his care for her ran far deeper than simple chance or temporary charity. News of Alpha Victor's response to the formal announcement reached the palace within days. and it was not the quiet acceptance Damien had hoped for. Instead, Victor had rallied support among several smaller territorial alphas who shared his ambitions, sending word that he intended to formally challenge the legitimacy of the bond before the full territorial council, insisting that Elena's lack of prior standing rendered any claimed connection suspect rather than sacred. Elena stood beside Damien in the Grand Council chamber weeks later, the room filled with representatives from every territory under his rule, along with Alpha Victor himself, whose expression carried a calculated confidence that immediately put Elena on edge, despite the reassuring presence of Damien's hand resting protectively at the small of her back. "Your Majesty," Victor began, his voice carrying practiced diplomatic courtesy that did nothing to mask the challenge beneath his words. "While I certainly respect the sanctity of fated bonds, I must raise concerns regarding the verification process used in this instance. Given the unusual circumstances of how this woman came to your attention, one must wonder whether proper protocol was truly followed, or whether personal feeling has influenced the healer's conclusions." Grace, standing among the assembled healers who had confirmed the bond, stepped forward with quiet but unmistakable authority. "The verification process followed every established protocol recognized across all 5 territories. Alpha Victor, I would be happy to walk the council through the specific bond markers examined, if you believe a review would ease your concerns." Victor's composure flickered slightly at Grace's direct challenge, though he recovered quickly, turning his attention instead toward Elena directly, his expression carrying a calculated coldness. "Perhaps the concern is not with the verification process itself, but with the suitability of someone with no established pack standing, no family alliance, no political value whatsoever, suddenly elevated to the position of queen. Surely the council must consider whether such an elevation serves the genuine interests of these territories, or merely the personal desires of our king." The chamber fell silent, tension crackling through the air as every representative present awaited how Damien would respond to such a direct challenge to both his judgment and Elena's worthiness. Elena felt her heart pounding, old fears threatening to resurface despite months of growing confidence. But she forced herself to stand tall, remembering everything she had survived, and everything Damien had promised her about her own inherent worth. "Alpha Victor," Damien said, his voice carrying a cold authority that immediately silenced any remaining murmurs throughout the chamber. "You speak of political value as though it were the only measure worth considering when determining who might serve these territories well as queen. Elena has demonstrated courage, integrity, and compassion throughout circumstances that would have broken far weaker individuals. She survived cruelty that most in this chamber cannot begin to imagine, and she did so without ever losing the fundamental kindness that makes her exactly the kind of leader these territories deserve." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled representatives before continuing. "But if political value is truly your concern, Alpha Victor, allow me to address that as well. Since Elena's arrival, 3 separate territories have expressed renewed confidence in my leadership, citing my willingness to address injustice within Blackwood territory as evidence of the fairness they can expect from my continued rule. Her presence has strengthened, not weakened, the stability of these territories." Elena felt a surge of gratitude at Damien's passionate defense, though she recognized this was her moment to speak for herself as well, rather than allowing others to fight this battle entirely on her behalf. She stepped forward slightly, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her directly. "Alpha Victor," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected given her nervousness. "You suggest that my lack of prior standing renders me unsuitable for the position I have been offered. I would ask you to consider, instead, what that same history has taught me, that someone born into privilege and power might never fully understand. I know what it means to be dismissed, to be treated as though my suffering mattered less than the convenience of those with power over my circumstances. I know what genuine injustice feels like, and I intend to ensure that no one within these territories ever suffers the way I once did, simply because those in power find it easier to look away." The chamber remained silent as Elena's words settled over the assembled representatives, several expressions shifting from skeptical to thoughtful as they considered her perspective. "You call my history a weakness," Elena continued, "but I believe it has instead prepared me to serve these territories with a depth of empathy and determination that privilege alone could never provide." Victor's expression tightened with obvious frustration at losing ground in the chamber's estimation, though he made one final attempt to salvage his challenge. "Pretty words are easily spoken, but they do not change the fundamental question of legitimacy that this council must consider. The legitimacy of this bond has already been thoroughly verified through established protocols," Damien said firmly, "and the character of my chosen mate has been demonstrated repeatedly through actions rather than mere words. If you wish to continue challenging this matter, Alpha Victor, I suggest you consider carefully whether such continued opposition serves your territory's genuine interests, or merely your own ambitions for influence beyond what you currently hold. The implicit threat within Damien's words was unmistakable, and Victor, recognizing that the council's sentiment had shifted decisively against his challenge, offered a stiff, reluctant acknowledgement before retreating from the matter entirely, though his expression made clear that his ambitions had not been fully extinguished, merely postponed for a more opportune moment. As the council session concluded and representatives began departing the grand chamber, Elena felt Damien's hand find hers, his expression carrying quiet pride at how she had handled Victor's challenge directly, rather than allowing fear to silence her. "You did not need me to defend you at all," he murmured, as they made their way from the chamber. "You defended yourself far more effectively than I ever could have." "I had a very good teacher," Elena replied, offering a small smile despite the lingering tension from the confrontation. "You taught me that my voice matters, that my history is not something to hide, but something that has shaped me into someone capable of leading with genuine understanding." Months later, as winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring across the territories, Elena stood once more at the edge of Blackwood territory, though this time she approached not as someone fleeing for her life, but as queen, arriving to oversee the formal transition of leadership following the reforms Damien had implemented since the tribunal. The gates that had once sealed shut behind her, condemning her to face a deadly storm alone, now opened wide in welcome, the new elders overseeing the pack having embraced the changes required to ensure no other Omega would ever face the cruelty Elena had endured. Damien stood beside her, his royal cloak resting once more across her shoulders, though this time the gesture carried none of the desperate urgency of that first storm-swept night, replaced instead by quiet, settled devotion, built over months of shared trials and deepening trust. "Do you remember," he said softly, "when I first wrapped this cloak around you, uncertain whether you would even survive the night?" "I remember everything about that night," Elena said, leaning slightly into his warmth as they gazed together at the packed territory that had once cast her aside. "I remember believing I had nothing left to live for, that no one in the world would notice or care about my absence." "You were wrong about that, even then," Damien said gently. "You simply had not yet found the people who would recognize your worth." Elena smiled, watching as members of Blackwood Pack gathered to greet their king and new queen with genuine warmth, rather than the fearful deference she remembered from her childhood there. The transformation felt almost impossible to fully comprehend, and yet here she stood, living proof that even the deepest cruelty need not define the entirety of someone's story. "This cloak," Elena said, fingers brushing against the familiar fabric that had saved her life so many months earlier, "will always remind me of the night everything changed. Not simply because you saved my life, Damien, but because you showed me, for the first time, what it truly means to be valued rather than merely tolerated." Damien drew her closer, his expression carrying the same steady warmth that had first drawn her toward trust and healing during those early weeks at the palace. "You saved yourself as much as I saved you," he said quietly. "Your strength, your resilience, your refusal to let cruelty define your worth, that is what truly transformed your circumstances. I simply had the honor of standing beside you while you did it." As they turned to walk together into the packed territory that had once left her to freeze in the darkness, Elena felt the weight of the cloak settle warmly across her shoulders, no longer a symbol of desperate rescue, but of the love and partnership that had grown from that terrible night into something neither of them could have imagined possible. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whether from ambitious rivals like Alpha Victor or the ordinary difficulties of ruling territories dependent on their wisdom and compassion, Elena faced the future not as the frightened, discarded Omega who had once believed herself worthless, but as a queen who understood, more deeply than most, exactly what genuine justice and belonging truly meant. The storm that had once nearly claimed her life had instead become the beginning of everything she had never dared to hope for, and as she walked beside Damien into the golden light of a new season, Elena finally allowed herself to fully believe what he had told her so many months before, that she deserved every bit of the happiness now unfolding before her. Not as charity, not as chance, but as the rightful outcome of her own unbreakable strength.